Absolutely beautiful. Now for a tough question. Has South Africa failed to guarantee the right to education for children with disabilities? Well, an estimated 500,000 disabled children are excluded from formal education here in South Africa. This was revealed in a report that was released by the South African Human Rights Commission and Human Rights Watch yesterday. Now, to tell us more about this, we are joined today by the Executive Director, Africa at Human Rights Watch, Mr. Daniel Bekele. A very good morning to you, Mr. Bekele. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thanks for being here.
The report says disabled children face discriminatory physical and other barriers when government classifies them according to their disabilities. Why and how is this robbing them of education?
Thank you. I really wish to begin by saying South Africa has actually made considerable progress in expanding educational opportunities since the end of apartheid, and the legacies of dealing with apartheid policies that has excluded generations of South Africans from educational opportunities is a huge one. But in spite of the progress that has been made, Human Rights Watch research has indeed found out that South Africa has failed to guarantee the right to education for a significant number of children with disabilities, which basically discriminates against them. And children with disabilities basically face multiple barriers when they try to access education from mainstream schools as well as special schools.
What is the problem? I see the numbers quite staggering. 500,000 in South Africa disabled children barriered or not getting formal education. That's a big number. How did you come up with the research? What kind of methodology? I see you've worked in 5 of the provinces?
Yes, the research work has covered 5 of the 9 provinces, and this number about at least 500,000 children with disabilities being excluded from school is actually a figure we have obtained from the Department of Basic Education. This is an information from a government department. And the barriers children with disabilities are facing are when they try to access mainstream schools. Schools often turn them down, referring them to special schools, often without a proper assessment whether or not they should be referred to special schools. And when they go to special schools, the waiting list is long. You know, some have been in a waiting list for years, and they are subjected to pay fees to access special schools. And some of the special schools might be farther away that parents are not able to send their kids to school. You know, all this and a number of other barriers has basically excluded a number of children with disabilities from accessing education, both in mainstream schools and in special schools. As you would be aware, South Africa has actually claimed that it has achieved universal enrollment for primary education this year, but this figure and this research shows that this is actually not correct.
What is the key obstacle for children in mainstream schools? Is it a question of infrastructure not being there, or is it a question of not the adequate teachers to assist?
Both of them and more. Basically, mainstream schools turn down children with disabilities because they think they should be educated in special schools. This is without proper assessment whether or not they should be referred to special schools. And the mainstream schools are not resourced enough to be able to accept and accommodate and respond to the needs of children with disabilities. And the staff and the teacher also need to be trained to be able to accommodate and respond to the needs of children with disabilities. So mainstream schools have the obligation to accept children with disabilities, and children with disabilities should also not be subjected to pay school fees. Other children without disabilities are not paying school fees. So it is multiple layers of barriers which is affecting children with disabilities as well as their parents.
In 2007, South Africa was one of the first countries to ratify the UN's Disability Rights Treaty, ensure that all children acquire the same skill set. 10 years on, almost, have we failed?
South Africa has ratified the treaty you mentioned and a number of other treaties that are relevant for the protection of the rights of children with disabilities. And South Africa has actually put in place a somewhat good policy about inclusive education back in 2001. And now, a few years into the road, that policy has not actually been properly implemented, because the provinces have actually prioritized in building specialized school as opposed to implementing the idea of inclusive education.
What's the state of special schools? We now see the state of what we would see as normal schools. What's the state of special schools for children with disabilities? Are there many shortcomings there as well?
The special schools that we have visited, a good number of them are designed in a way they can respond to some particular kind of special needs of children with disabilities. But the most important question is whether the policy should be sending children with disabilities to specialized schools, which is a policy of segregation and further discrimination, as opposed to implementing a policy of inclusive education where children with disabilities are included in the mainstream schools. That is the policy that South Africa has actually put in place, and which is in line with the international commitments and which really needs to be implemented. Well,
I thank you for joining us. It's an interesting report and an interesting statistic. That's Executive Director Africa at Human Rights Watch, Mr. Daniel Bekele. Thank you very much for joining us. The number is simply concerning. 500,000 children living with disabilities in South Africa are sitting outside of the formal education sector, or the report says they're excluded